And while we're still in a meditative mode, just for a few minutes, we'll shift our attention away from the breath. I think all of you know how to do this. We'll shift to cultivating bodhicitta. So grounded in great love and great compassion. And so I'll just give a few moments of a couple minutes of silence to cultivate bodhicitta motivation. Well, now with that bodhicitta in mind, we can do or in our hearts, we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. to the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. Well, in last class, we kind of finished the section on the Vaibhashika school, and today we'll start the section on the Sautondrikas school, or tenet system. But I thought actually just to say something brief before we start the Sautondrika, or they call it here, in the text, they call it the Suture school, Sautondrika, the Suture school. But I just thought to say something brief, which is, just very briefly, which is, remember, like, so we're studying the 4 different tenet systems, right? So we, in the 4, right, are Vaibhashika, Sautondrika, Chittamatra, or mind only, and then Madhyamaka, middle way. And I thought to say a few, like, one is, as Tibetan Buddhists, and then as particularly in, the kind of text we're following follows the tradition of Tibetan tradition, and particularly in this case, the tradition of Tsongkhapa. So in the Tibetan tradition, though, I just want to emphasize this point, like, as all Tibetan traditions prioritize or kind of hold the Prasangika view as particularly the most profound. And I just want to emphasize this point. So from the Prasangika perspective, in terms of, it's interesting, right? Like, they sometimes they call it the one vehicle theory. So there is, from a Prasangika perspective, they say all the vehicles eventually, it's like all the rivers end up in the ocean, all the vehicles end up in the, everybody eventually needs to become a Buddha, is the idea, right? And so from a Prasangika Madhyamaka perspective, the Buddha's ultimate intent is that all beings realize emptiness, according as described by the Prasangika view, and become Buddhas eventually. So and it's an interesting point. Like, so I'm just want to remind people, like, one is, I've already said there are many reasons to study these different tenet systems, which I think is true, but I did want to emphasize this point that and actually maybe I'll read this one quote even. It's from, they talk about, so this says it, that the purpose of one text says part of the purpose of teaching other Buddhist tenets, is to help those outsiders who are afraid of the idea of emptiness to gradually give up egocentrism. So the idea there is that actually for many people, if you were to go straightly to the teaching on, like, a lack of all intrinsic existence, it would be overwhelming. It would be frightening. It would be disturbing. And so part of the idea is that there's a value in teaching, less radical views of selflessness, so that people can gradually relax their grasping of the self and get prepared to realize emptiness. And actually, like, even if you look at Buddhist history, right? Like, I remember early on in my own studies of Buddhism, I remember hearing Bob Thurman say this, which I thought was an interesting point, is that, even according to the Mahayana, right? The Mahayana scriptures were hidden for a long time, right? After the Buddha's time, right? They, like, the story goes that Nagarjuna, right, went to the land of the Nagas and retrieved the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and some of the other Mahayana sutras. And so in that lecture, Bob Thurman was saying, well, why were they hidden there? And part of his point was that India wasn't ready even yet for the radical teaching of the Prajnaparamita. And so that they needed to be the Buddha needed to teach them, but they needed to be just for select disciples. And that the culture almost needed to kind of give up a certain amount of egotism to be ready to hear the radical teaching of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And so the idea is like that, is that these other tenet systems in part are to prepare one, actually, for the radical teaching of lack of nature or lack of intrinsic existence. But according to the Mahayana, particularly according to the Prasangika view, all those different views eventually lead us up to that radical teaching. And also, there are these teachings where one sort of, like we said that last time, the Vaibhashika school's view is that, when one achieves the level of a, say, Pracheka Buddha, that's a final state, right, that then leads to a kind of extinction. And again, like a Prasangika would say, well, for somebody who's too afraid of the radical compassion of staying infinitely to benefit infinite beings, and sort of that's a useful tool for such a person to think, well, okay, it's time limited. I'm not committing forever, something like that. But of course, from Prasangika perspective, ultimately you are around forever. You have a consciousness that has no end, and you'll be present, and the idea is that you be present as a Buddha to others infinitely, right? But if that's scary, then sometimes it's useful to have another, and you can see that actually, right? And anyway, so you get my point. I just wanted to say that. So the idea is that there's only one vehicle according to the Prasangika school. In other words, all the vehicles end up in the Mahayana, and all views end up in emptiness. But even Prasangikas would say the Buddha taught these other systems, and that the Buddha did that out of profound compassion and skillful means to benefit disciples. So I wanted to say that just by way of kind of orienting us after the last class and before this, now entering a new system of the Suture school, Sautondrika school. And I wanted to say one other thing, like about the Sautondrika school, because again, we're studying these schools, and you can say, well, Sautondrika school, of course, is an ancient school that goes back to the time of the Buddha and so on, which we're about to get into. But I actually want to share this, so we just finished the Vaibhashika school, right? And the Vaibhashika school, as we said, emphasizes, what's the ultimate truth according to them, right? It's these directionally partless particles and unsubdividable moments, right, of time or consciousness. And actually, one thing I was reflecting on is this, so you might think the Sautondrika school is some sort of distant in time. But actually, as we study it, I want to suggest something just to think about, and maybe I'll read a quote in a second about this. But I actually think many modern Buddhists in America are quite close to the Sautondrika, or actually closest in their view to Sautondrika school. Because not many modern people living in the US are going to hold to directionally partless particles and unsubdividable moments of consciousness as the ultimate reality, right? But actually, well, maybe I won't read that quote. I guess what I would suggest is, as we go through the Sautondrika school, I'll read it later, but I want to say, I want to actually think about this, because I actually think people whose view is, if you were going to, people's views aren't always exactly in accordance with any school, but I actually want to suggest that if you think about people who practice Buddhism, I think you'll be able to see that their views are probably, some of them, their views are the closest of these tenet systems would be the Sautondrika school. And also the ideas when you practice, even when practicing mindfulness as it's taught in the US, sometimes in the kind of, I don't mean secular mindfulness, but Buddhist mindfulness, you might find that it's actually the way it's taught is quite close to the Sutra school, actually. Even though they say it comes from the Theravadins, which are actually technically, from a historical perspective, aligned with the Vaibhashikas, I actually think the way it's taught is often more close to the Sutra school. This is my own opinion now. Obviously, people could disagree, and that's not a traditional text saying modern people teach it that way. But I want you to listen to as we go through the Sautondrika school. I just requesting it, or suggesting rather, that people think about that, and then we'll talk about it as we get further into it. And I don't want to say, I realize if I jump ahead and try to say what I mean by that too much, then it'll sort of muddy the waters in terms of what does the Sutra school actually teach. But once we've studied that a bit, then maybe we can compare it to what people hear from friends, for example. And you may realize, wow, the Sautondrika school is not so distant, actually. But then John had a comment or a question, I think.
It's a question. I had made an assumption, which maybe is incorrect. The 4 schools that we're talking about, I thought these were things that evolved after Shakyamuni Buddha did his teachings. Is it that belief that he actually did these 4 distinct teachings and created 4 schools while he was still alive?
The idea, it's a good question. The idea is, I mean, I guess I'll say, it's an interesting point. Like, one way to say it is this, is as historical sort of, on the one hand, of course, one can identify like historical, through over the past 2,500 some odd years, one can recognize sort of historical figures that are sort of identified with different schools that started traditions and school, actual places, like, institutions that are connected to these things and texts and so on. But yeah, no, the view is though that the Buddha taught these different, that when the Buddha, actually, if you look in the sutras, what you see is that the Buddha would come across a person, right? Like if you look in the actual sutras, the Buddha wasn't somebody who just started, what's the word? Like, actually, it's a Buddhist tradition, isn't it? You're supposed to be asked 3 times, right, to teach before you teach or something. So the Buddha wouldn't just teach, right? Somebody would come up and ask him a question or say, please explain this, and then the Buddha would answer them, right? And then, so what happened though was that, and then they say monks memorized what he said and wrote it down and all that. But anyway, my point is that, reference to your question, as people looked at the different answers Buddha gave and different words Buddha spoke, what they realized was that they were for different types of people, right? And that sometimes the Buddha used language that indicated one thing, and other times the Buddha taught language that indicated another thing. And so the idea is that, yeah, all these different 4 tenet systems, which are historical in one sense, right? Over time, they became identified with certain authors and certain commentators. But those commentators always go back to original teachings of the Buddha. And so you could say that the Buddha, in a sense, taught all 4 of these tenet systems in the sense that none of these are made up. Like all Buddhists would, Tibetan Buddhists anyway, like even, say, Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen, who wrote this text that we're studying. Now, he was obviously a follower of the Prasangika school ultimately. But Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen would say all of these were taught by the Buddha, and that these historical figures. So, for example, like in the Suture school, one of the 2 subsets of the Suture school are the followers of reason, who are Dharmakirti. Their texts, they trace texts back to Dharmakirti and Dignaga, who are the logicians, the Pramana authors. But we don't. So we would say, okay, that school is identified with Dharmakirti and Dignaga as historical figures. But one would say, well, where did they get their teachings from? And they would say, well, there's the teaching on pramana. There's a sutra, the Sutra of Valid Cognition, and that the Buddha taught that sutra and that they were commenting on that. So you would still trace that lineage back to the Buddha. So yeah, the idea is that all of these were ultimately taught by the Buddha, but were then sort of became different throughout history, different sort of lines of transmission, you could call it, or in India over the centuries that followed after the Buddha's death. But the Tibetan view would be that all of these were ultimately taught by the Buddha. These weren't sort of just made up after the Buddha's time. That the Buddha taught these different approaches for different kinds of disciples, and some disciples were of sharper faculties, and some were of less sharp faculties, and so some are more advanced, and some are more simplistic or more gross, subtler and grosser. But yeah, the idea is that they all come from the Buddha ultimately.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, so, and then I won't say more about this sort of, I'll come back to this point about how this Sautondrika school relates to current times or something, or, ways to look at that later. But, and for those who are following the text, we're on page 8, which is the beginning of the Sutra school section, Sautondrika or Sutra school. And again, like I said before, all of these sections, each of the 4 tenet systems is broken down into the same structure. Tibetans are quite, Tibetan monastic authors are very good at outlines, so they, so this text has the same, every section, all 4 of the major sections will have the same 7 subheadings, right? So it says the explanation of the Sutra school has 7 outlines: the definition, the divisions, the etymology, the way of asserting objects, the way of asserting object possessors, the way of asserting selflessness, and the presentation of the grounds and paths. So that's like the outline again, and it's the same 7 points, but we're going to cover them according to the Sutra school now. And so the first, we'll just go through them now. Yeah. Okay, so the first is definition, right? So the definition of a proponent of sutra, which is how this translator is translating Sautondrika, is a person propounding lesser vehicle tenets who accepts both self-knowers and external objects. And so actually, let's go over that one slowly, right? So first of all, a person propounding lesser vehicle tenets, right? And I said this. So actually, I'll ask you guys, first of all, what's the difference, according to that definition, what's the difference between a Sautondrika and a Vaibhashika, according to the definition itself? Does anybody catch it, or should I say? Sujata?
Don't think they're self-knowers in, okay.
That's the difference, exactly. Yep, you got it. Because right, because Vaibhashikas and Sautondrikas are both propounding lesser vehicle tenets, first of all, right? That they have in common. And remember, lesser vehicle tenets, it's an interesting point, right? We said this for Vaibhashikas, I'll just remind you briefly. I'm not going to go into huge detail, but so what is, we sometimes call it individual liberation vehicle, right? Because lesser is sort of pejorative, but the author here, you know, they're saying lesser vehicle is a translation of Hinayana, right? Which is a Mahayana term for vehicle of individual liberation. But a person propounding lesser vehicle tenets doesn't have to be a lesser vehicle person, right? A bodhisattva, first of all, you could be there's such a, you know, you can imagine there could be a person who has bodhicitta in there, has realized bodhicitta, but is propounding lesser vehicle tenets in the sense of philosophy, right? But it's a person who is, in general, it's a set of philosophical tenets that are associated with the vehicle of individual liberation. And those are usually, right, the Pali Canon is associated with that, right? So the Pali Canon of Buddhist scriptures. I read, I'm not going to remember the number. Geshe Soga pointed out in his commentary to this that, you know, if you look at like the over 100 volumes, or 100, I think it's over, I think it might be 108 volumes or whatever of the Kongyur in Tibetan, there are just a few lesser vehicle sutras translated into Tibetan, whereas the Pali Canon is all sutras of that type. But so it's propounding sutras that come from that tradition, right? Propounding a view or tenets that come from that tradition. And the last part, that they accept external objects, that's the exact same, right, as the Vaibhashikas. They also accept external objects. The difference is that followers of the Sautondrika accept self-knowers. And so, so I thought this time it's probably worth pausing a little bit to talk just a little about self-knowers and what are they. And I said this, I said a little of this last time, I'll kind of go through it. So the view of a first of all, the Sautondrikas are not the only ones who accept self-knowers. Chittamatran, mind-only school followers, or Chittamatrans also accept self-knowers. That's one point. And also, I think Yogacara, Sautondrika, Madhyamikas also accept self-knowers technically, although I don't need to get to that level of detail. But what's a self-knower, right? So the idea here is, and I want to be clear, Prasangika Madhyamikas do not accept self-knowers. So in other words, like, so that they're not only do Vaibhashikas not accept them, but Prasangika Madhyamikas don't accept self-knowers. But what is a self-knower according to this school? What this school says is this: is that how do you account for, like, if you remember, they usually give an example. A typical example might be, actually, think about what they get at is memory, right? So this is why they assert self-knowers, is to account for memory. And usually they use the example of seeing a patch of blue, but I actually want to use, just for our discussion, what you do is think about something for a moment, right? Think about a time when you saw some famous site, right? Like some famous place you've been to, like, you know, whether it's like, whatever, you know, the Golden Gate Bridge, or the Statue of Liberty, or something, whatever, right? And if you remember that, first of all, you can remember the object, right? So you can remember, oh, wow, like, you know, the Statue of Liberty looks like this. And, you know, I remember the first time I saw the Statue of Liberty, it was under, like, they were refurbishing it or something. So the first time I went there, I remember it. So they had like scaffolds, you know, so I can remember that, right? So you can remember the object. But they say, these philosophers say, but you don't only remember the object, you remember being there, right? Like, you can remember seeing it, like, oh, I saw the Golden Gate Bridge, or I saw the Statue of Liberty, right? And I can remember, like, when I just thought of that, I was like, oh, I was a little kid. I grew up in New York area, so I was a kid, and I went there, and like, So I can remember I was a little kid and it seemed so big, right? So they say, well, how do you remember that you saw it? And they say, if you remember that you saw it, you must have perceived yourself seeing it. Right? That's their, they would say, otherwise, how can you account for the fact that you can remember having perceived? You see, I mean, you don't just remember the object, you remember your experience, your perception of the object. And so Sautondrika philosophers, they would say, here's the actual logical assertion. This is the way they would say it. And this is in the form of a proof statement in Buddhist logic. They would say, the subject, right, subject and object. So the subject, an eye consciousness, apprehending blue, has a self-knower because at a later time, it is possible to have a memory of that eye consciousness having apprehended blue, right? So that's their proof in a sense, right? If you can remember having perceived, then you must have perceived yourself perceiving, right? And so their view then is that in each moment of perception, there's an aspect of consciousness that's focused on whatever the object of your perception. But then there's another part of your awareness that's sort of in a very basic way, aware of being aware of that object. That's a self-knower, right? And it's because of that aspect of your awareness that's aware of being aware of the object, it's because of that you can remember having been aware of it. So that's what they're getting at when they say they accept self-knowers. And their view would be, if there weren't such a thing, then you would never remember that you'd seen things, right? That's their position. Yes, and self-knowers are asserted by Sautondrikas, Chitamatrans, and certain Sautondrika philosophers. So it's quite a common assertion, according to numerous Buddhist philosophical systems. We'll get into this a little bit with the Prasangika school, but there's a famous part of Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, which is a Prasangika text, where he says, a sword cannot cut itself. Right? And so what he's saying is awareness can't be aware of itself at the same moment. So that's a Prasangika argument. But this school would say, of course, it must be able to perceive itself. Otherwise, there'd be no memory. So it's these are two different philosophical systems that have different views. But anyway, according to this school, there are self-knowers, right? So this school accepts, and then external objects, right? So this school accepts external objects just as the Vaibhashikas did. Oh, not just as. Vaibhashikas also accepted. They accept them in a different way. But this school accepts that external objects exist, right? Obviously, mind-only school does not, right? So it's going to be different when we get to that school. But this school accepts that there are external objects. Okay, so that's the definition of a proponent of Suture or Sautondrika. And then it gives a synonym. It says proponents of Suture are Sautondrikas, and exemplifier Darshantikas are equivalent. And usually, to be honest, the word Sautondrika is used, but this phrase exemplifier just refers to the fact that followers of this school often use examples or similes or metaphors to present their argument. And actually, oftentimes, if you read like texts by Dharmakirti and Dignaga and Buddhist philosophers, they say you're supposed to give it. They often say that. They say you're supposed to present a logical argument and then give an example, right? So they gave the example here, a patch of blue or something, or sometimes they'll give the example of a dream or of an illusion, but you're supposed to sort of present an example to help prove, when you present a logical proof, you're supposed to give an example of it, for example, often. And so sometimes this school is called exemplifiers because they use a lot of examples when explaining their doctrine. But we'll use the term Sautondrika because that's the most commonly used one. And it's the one the author here uses. Okay, so that's it. That's the definition. Then divisions. So he says there are two divisions, followers of scripture and followers of reasoning. And then he says, an example of a follower of scripture is a proponent of Sutra or Sautondrika who follows Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha, the treasury of manifest knowledge. And then the second, he says, an example of a follower of reasoning is a proponent of Sutra who follows Dharmakirti's 7 treatises on pramana or valid cognition. And I want to make a little bit of comment on that. So, so there are 2 types of Sautondrikas then, is what he's saying, right? Followers of scripture and followers of reasoning. What's usually explained at this point is that followers of scripture are considered Sautondrikas of dull faculties, and followers of reasoning are considered Sautondrikas of sharp faculties. And the idea there is that, the followers of scripture, right? What they're saying there is that, they read a text like Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha, right? And they memorize the categories and they believe in that and have trust in it, but they don't do a logical analysis to see, is that really true or not, right? They just sort of accept it on faith. They respect Vasubandhu and they respect the Buddha. And so they say, okay, I respect, out of respect to these great teachers, I follow this Abhidharma text. But they don't analyze it. And the Abhidharma texts don't present reasonings, actually, extensively to prove its points. So that's what I mean by a follower of dull faculties, in the sense that it's not somebody who relies on analysis and reasoning to prove the point. You guys heard the Dalai Lama often makes this joke at that point where when he actually is teaching on these kind of things, which now you'll see where he says sometimes when he's talking to, he says specifically some followers of the Pali Canon who don't follow reasoning, who follow scripture in this sense. He makes this joke where he says, oh, like y'all are like people with like an old person with no teeth. And he says you have to eat soft things and you can't chew it when it gets hard. He says we're followers of the Nalanda tradition and we follow reasoning of Dharmakirti and Dignaga and Chandrakirti. And he said we can chew, like in other words, even if you give us something very difficult to eat, we can chew it and digest it because we use analysis and logic and so on. And he says so. So he's making this. He's kind of implying what we're getting at here, which is that's a disciple of sharp faculty, somebody who relies upon reasoning. Okay. So and one other point. So the followers of scripture among the Sautondrikas, the example are followers of Abhidharma Kosha. And they tend to have faith, but not use reasoning. They tend to be they call duller faculties. And also, they sometimes say this, that those followers accept self-knowers, but otherwise are very similar to Vaibhashikas in their tenets. So they accept self-knowers, so they're not Vaibhashika. But other than that, they tend to believe in a similar way to the Vaibhashikas. So mostly as we go forward and talk about the Sautondrikas, we're going to talk about the unique faculties of Sautondrikas. So we're going to be talking mostly about the followers of reasoning from this point forward, primarily. Not exclusively, but primarily. So the followers of reasoning, right, that it says here of the proponents of Suture, Sautondrikas follow Dharmakirti, 7 treatises on valid cognition. And Dharmakirti, so remember this lineage, right, comes from, the Buddha actually taught a sutra called the Sutra on the Pramana Sutra, the Sutra on Valid Cognition. Dignaga famously wrote an important commentary to that. And then Dharmakirti followed Dignaga and wrote 7 treatises, and those became important parts of the Buddhist tradition of what we call pramana. So, and pramana is actually a big topic, isn't it? It's like, we sometimes say valid cognition is how they translate it, but actually it includes Buddhist, the basic core elements of Buddhist reasoning, Buddhist epistemology, or knowing how we know. So it analyzes all these different topics, right? How do you know what you know? What's the correct reason? How do you analyze a doctrine from a perspective of reasoning, and so on? So it's a Buddhist area that covers logic, sort of core philosophical tenets, epistemology, kind of Buddhist psychology, Buddhist, so there are various things covered in pramana. And the pramana texts are wonderful texts, by the way. I've got to study them a bit, but they're amazing. So anyway, we're going to mostly, as we go forward studying the Sutra school, we're going to rely primarily on the followers of reasoning, because that's what Jetsun Chokyi Gyaltsen does. And these sections are pretty straightforward, so I'll just go quickly through this part too. The etymology. Why are they called proponents of Sutra? They are called proponents of Sutra due to propounding tenets through following the sutras of the Bhagavad, meaning the Buddha, right? And they are called exemplifiers due to desiring to teach all phenomena by way of examples, right? So that's pretty straightforward, right? Not surprisingly, they're called proponents of Sutra because they follow sutras. So they derive their doctrine mainly from sutras. Now we start the subtle, now we're going to, now we'll start the subtle, the actual tenets of this school. So we'll start with the very first, right? The definition of existent is that observed by a valid cognizer. And I just want to pause there again. Like we did, this is similar to what we said in, anyway, it's a little different actually from the Vaibhashika definition, but they're similar in a way. What I want to say is this, is like, so what is an existent phenomena, right? An existent phenomena is that which is observed or known, right, by a valid cognizer. That's an interesting, I just want to pause again just to reflect together. That's not, I mean, that's almost like, usually that would just be like, that's the definition, right? Of a thing, of an existent phenomena. But I just want to suggest to contemplate that, that's a humongous topic, isn't it? That for something to exist, it's known, right? It's an object of knowledge to a valid cognizer, right? So one is one point there is if it's known by a mistaken cognizer, it's not an existent phenomena, right? But another is like, the reason why I'm pausing, one is that's true, right? So if it's known by a mistaken cognizer, it's not an existent phenomena. Right? That's very important because, for example, the substantially existent, permanent, independent self would be something known by a cognizer that's not valid, right? That's one point. But another point is, I haven't think about this in this point, like, is that how you think of an existent phenomena? Like if I were to say, the garbage truck, does the garbage truck that comes through your neighborhood, which exist, right? And what do you mean by it exists, right? So and what they're getting at, I'm just picking it as like an actual physical object, right? Like, and the idea here is that it exists because it's known, right? By a valid cognizer. Is that how you usually think of it? Or if you ask, does your nose exist? Right? And if you say, well, it exists because it's known by a valid cognizer, right? Because, and actually notice the difference, right? The garbage truck, which is external to you, and then the nose, which is part of your own continuum of being. And actually, in either case, does it feel like usually you relate to that as existent because it's known, it's an object of knowledge? And I think, I don't know what your experience is. For myself, if I don't catch myself, oftentimes it feels like the garbage truck has nothing to do with being known. It just exists, right? That's how it feels oftentimes to me anyway. I don't know if it's the same for you, but, or my example of earlier, the Statue of Liberty. It doesn't feel like, this is saying is, does the Statue of Liberty exist? How do you know it exists? Because it's known by, or in what sense is it an existent phenomenon? It's an existent phenomenon because it's known by valid cognition. Right? And again, to me, whether it's the garbage truck or the Statue of Liberty, it feels like it exists independent of that. Right? But this school is saying the definition of existent is known by a valid cognizer. So I just think that in and of itself is a very profound point, is that that's the very definition of existent. Anyway. And then it says, no, this is similar. John, sorry, go ahead. You have a question?
Yeah, maybe this is oversimplified, but how do they define a valid cognizer? Is that a special recognized being, or is every being deemed to be a valid cognizer? I usually tell of your nose. You probably know your nose better than anyone else. But if you're not a valid cognizer, then does your nose exist?
Again, according to this school, and we'll get into this as we go along, but actually there's a whole section on valid cognition in this text, so we'll get into more detail about that. But according to this school, according to this school's view, you have valid cognition, I have valid cognition, all of us have valid cognition. According to this school, we all have valid cognizers. You know, so like and we're about to get into that. So I'll go into a little more detail in reference to your question. Like, if yeah, like, so if I look out the window and if I'm like looking out the window and let's say, well, like you said, it's quite loud, so I'll hear and see the garbage truck simultaneously usually. And anyway, so, and when I see the garbage truck, let's say, that according to this school, that would be considered a valid cognizer, right? I saw it via direct perception with my eye consciousness, and that's a valid cognition. So in that sense, that would be, so that like, so an ordinary person does have valid cognition according to this school. And that would be an example where then, and so it's an existent phenomena and it was seen by a valid cognition in that case. So yes, you don't have to be a Buddha or something like that to have a valid cognition according to this school, or a bodhisattva or anything of that sort. Ordinary people have, you know, and even like animals have valid cognition in that sense, in the sense that like if an animal, you know, if a bird sees a branch and lands on it, that's a valid cognition. You know, it has a direct perception of the branch and it lands on it, that's a valid cognition according to this school. So this school, I mean, you don't have to be human to have a valid cognition in that very, very basic sense. And Ryan, yeah.
So, you know, not to borrow a phrase from Donald Rumsfeld here, but so unknown unknowns. So if you had a planet out in space and no one ever knew of it and nothing ever cognized it, you would say it doesn't exist, at least until such a thing is perceived by a valid cognizer. And then and I guess from there is like, I'm assuming we'll talk about it, but don't you run into the dangers of like a solipsistic view of the universe if only what appears in your own mind actually exists?
Well, and one point that's important is that I mean, according to this school, it's not saying, well, one is external objects exist according to this school, but the other is it's not saying that has to be your valid cognizer. So in other words, if somebody else validly has a valid cognition of an object, then that object would be said to exist. So like, you know, so if you were to say, you know, the typical Buddhist example, right, that the Buddha knew his cousin Devadatta or something, right? Like, you would say, well, that was a valid cognizer, even though I never perceived Devadatta myself. You know, Devadatta existed because he was the object of a valid cognition of Shakyamuni Buddha or something like that, or whatever. So one point is it's not saying, one point is it's not saying that, it's not saying that only things I perceive exist. It's saying it must be a valid cognition by somebody is one point. And then the other, though, I'll just mention is that according to this school, it's interesting. It's because they're also saying external objects exist, right? So what they would say actually is that the garbage, one way they would present it actually is that the garbage truck exists because it performs various functions, right? It can carry garbage and all that. But another function it can perform is it can serve as the basis for a valid eye consciousness perceiving it, right? And so in that sense, it produces an effect. One effect is it can carry trash. Another effect is it can, you know, a person can hold on the back and drive, you know, and get a ride. But another effect it can produce is, you know, if I look out the window as it's driving by, it can give rise to a visual consciousness perceiving it. And for the person holding it, it can give rise to a tactile consciousness holding on to it and so on. And so they would say it's an external object and that it gives rise to, one of the effects it can give rise to is perception, actually. So it's not in that sense, it's not a solipsistic in that sense, if that makes sense. One is various beings can perceive it, but the other is it's an external object, and that the way, and one of the effects it gives rise to is perception. Yeah, and Lynn.
Okay. It seems like, and maybe this is epistemological and not what you're trying to get at, but what it seems to do is to pull back, pull the perceiver back from the object so that the relationship is what's important rather than either one of them independently. In other words, you need both to be existent, but it's like, it's actually saying you're not inherently existent because it's only your relationship with this object that makes the object existent. I'm not saying this very well, but I mean, it's basically, it's a way of negating yourself because you're only existent vis-a-vis the object you perceive or someone perceiving you.
Well, and it's an interesting point. I guess one thing that's interesting about what you're saying, which I think is worth, this is why I think this is partly why, I think actually, Lynn, what you're getting at is part of what the great value is of studying these different tenet systems, right? Is as you think about that definition and what you're getting at in terms of what are the implications of that definition, one of the things you start to say is, well, you start to almost wonder is, well, how, once you say the definition of an existent is that which is known or observed by a valid cognizer, right? How do you not eventually end up in the Prasangika perspective, right? That's where you're heading in a way with
Right.
your comment.
Right.
Is like, well, wait a second, then how do things exist? And what's really interesting, I think, is if you think about, and this is why I think that studying this school, for example, helps us understand Prasangika thought,
Right.
is a Prasangika, right, could say, there's no object that exists independent of the perceiver, and there's no perceiver that exists independent of the object, right?
Right.
And a follower of the Sautondrikas school would say, the object, an external object of perception, has to have its own nature, its own entity, externally in order to give rise to your perception. So it does exist out there, right? If it didn't exist out there, it wouldn't give rise to a perception. You'd just be hallucinating. So it must have its own nature from its own side, which then your eye consciousness, can have an interdependent relationship with in order to perceive it. So the object has to have its own entity or nature. Your eye consciousness has to have its own nature and function. And therefore, together, they can give rise to a visual perception. And actually, if you think about that, it's interesting, right? You would say, well, wait a second. If you actually think deeply about it, you say, well, how's that wrong, right? In other words, the external object has to have, like the garbage truck has to be made of metal or something, whatever, it wouldn't work. And so it exists out there. And then my eye consciousness has its own nature. And therefore, together, they give rise to an experience. But they both have their own existence. They would, like this school would say, the garbage truck has to have its own existence from its side in order to give rise to that experience. The Prasangika would disagree with that, of course, but you start to see the subtlety of the difference now, and you can start to appreciate. For me, then you can go, oh wow, like I can see how you start to go. If you start to argue, my point is this: is actually if you start to argue the Sutra school's position, right? Well, wait a second, it has to have its own nature. It has to exist out there in order to be perceived, right? And then you say, well, wait, why would a Prasangika disagree with that? Seems like you would start to feel like that seems true. Like, yes, perception is, of course, requires both, which this school would agree with, right? But this school would say perception requires both a subject and an object, but both have to have some existence from their own side in order to then have a relationship. And the Prasangikas would say, no, they can't have a relationship if they have their own nature, right? Then there would be no relationship. And then you have to go, which is right. And that helps you really start to get deeper into what are the Madhyamikas actually saying? Does that make sense? If you just read the Madhyamikas and you don't do this, it's like, oh yeah, everything's interdependent, fine, right? these guys are not, Dignaga and Dharmakirti are not, they're amazing philosophers, right? And so you start to study their view of it, and you go, what's the difference between them and the Prasangika philosopher? And then you see it's subtle, the difference, right? Do things have their own nature? You know, they both agree that that perception is interdependent, but do things have to have their own entity from their own side in order to be perceived? This school would say, the garbage truck, if you're seeing it, it has to have something from its own side, right? Of course, like otherwise you'd be hallucinating garbage trucks, and that's ridiculous, you know.
It's almost like an interim idea before you get to you and the truck is empty. It's almost like on a continuum. You get to here, and then you get all the way where we want to be.
That's exactly, and that's what I was getting at earlier. Now you can see why these schools of philosophy help you eventually. You know, that's what I read that quote earlier, right? Where it's almost like, you know, they help us decrease our grasping so that we can eventually get to a Prasangika's perspective. And they really do help with that, you know, because they're closer to our normal sense of things, but they're challenging our normal sense of things.
Right.
And they help us move towards the direction of the Prasangika view, is partly why they teach it so much, you know, why the Buddhist tradition of Tibet teaches this, is that it really helps. Yeah.
So a Prasangika Madhyamaka, you know, they propound a non-dualism, right? I mean, object and perceiver are interdependent completely. How does, I guess I don't see how this school, the Suture school, avoids a dualistic view of the universe if they propound, you know, externally existent objects that have their own nature. Or do they not? I mean, is it a dualistic view of reality?
Yeah, I remember this school. I mean, part of the definition, right, was this school accepts external objects.
So it is dualistic.
Yeah, I don't think this school would say anything about non-dualism. Actually, I don't think that would be their. I don't think they would. I've never. I maybe they do, but I haven't seen the text that would use that phrase from this school's perspective. Rahi has it.
This may be taking it off in a little bit of another direction, but where does subjectivity come into play with valid cognizers? Because let's say you're in a group and one person says, oh, Joe over here is angry, and the other person says, no, he's sad. Or you're in a group and one person's arguing for the existence of God and another is not. So how does validity come into play there?
That's an interesting question. We'll get, actually, I want to see, one thing I want to double check is, so there's a section on valid cognition here. Yeah. So actually this one thing I like about this text actually is that we'll get, on the way of asserting object possessors section of the text, they actually go through the different types of valid cognition. And so we'll get to that actually, like where they'll really, this school, one of the wonderful strengths of this particular school, the Sutra school, you know, following Dignaga and Dharmakirti, is that they get at those questions. They get at like, you know, where is the line where what's the word? A cognition is valid and not valid? What are the types of valid cognition? And so, you know, and I think, well, that we'll get at it. So one is we'll get into that more in this text as we go into that section. And the other is, you know, so one thing this school really, I think, is good at is differentiating, like sometimes let's say people, right, can perceive, could be together, let's say, and they can both have a valid cognition that are different. Then there are other times where one is an invalid cognition, right? And actually it's really interesting point, like this school and the, you know, how do you differentiate that? You know, and this school is good. This school, we'll get into that, I think, where this school looks at, sometimes, you know, two people can look at something and both have a valid different perspective, and there are other times where one perspective is valid and the other is not. And this school, I actually, you know, kind of almost specializes in how do you know the difference? How do you tell for yourself, you know, and also for ourselves, right? How do I tell when I'm having a mistaken perception versus a valid cognition? that's a real strength of this school. So I think we'll get into that when it gets to that section in detail. But yeah, I think it's a great question because it's a really important point, isn't it? Like for all of us, like how do we know when we're having invalid or mistaken cognitions? And yeah, I really do believe that that's a strength of Dignaga and Dharmakirti, using logic and reasoning to see, am I having, what kind of perception am I having actually? Yeah. Yeah, and I think actually that, I think, and again, that's another reason why I think it's great to study the Sautondrika school, is that otherwise, I was actually just the other day, somebody met Shayla as my partner. We were talking about this and we were talking, conversation, we were saying, where in Buddhism do you we were having this, she was asking that, where in Buddhism do you get the teaching on that question of like, how do you know, how, like in ordinary life, she was talking about with emptiness. She was saying like in ordinary life where you really can see like how, when you're misperceiving a social situation or an interpersonal situation and I was sort of contemplating, I was saying it's Dharmakirti actually. It's these teachings where if you apply them to your ordinary experience, you start, then you can actually, because I think it's what you were getting at, Varai, it's like, then you can actually, if you apply that teaching, you can go, oh, wow, I was having, I was having doubt. I wasn't having a valid cognition. Or I was having, whatever, wrong view, or I was having some other way of perceiving that was not pramana, was not valid cognition. And so I think those teachings are humongously useful for our understanding of emptiness, but also for daily life, like in a sense, kind of what you were getting at, right? Like, am I misperceiving this person? Yeah, because if you think about it, a lot of the other aspects of Buddhism don't get at that. I think this school is really great at getting at that, because the other schools they're maybe not interested in that. They're just interested, but this school actually gets at those kind of questions very deeply. Well, now, so now comes the next part. So that was the definition of an existent, right? And now we're going to get into, I'll spend the rest of the time on this, right? There are two types of existence: conventional truths and ultimate truths, right? And one thing that's really fascinating, I think, is that every school, right, we're going to go through, every tenet system has a view of what's a conventional truth and what's an ultimate truth, right? And they're all different. So they all use the same terms, right? Conventional truth and ultimate truth, but they all have a different meaning to what does that mean? What is a conventional truth and what's an ultimate truth? And we're going to get into what do Sautondrikas mean when they say ultimate truth and conventional truth. And I actually would preface this by saying, I think, because of having just come from the study of the Vaibhashikas, and also most of you are familiar with a little bit with Madhyamaka thought, I was thinking about this as I was sort of thinking about it yesterday afternoon rather, thinking about teaching today on this. And I was thinking about I almost want to warn you guys. I think at first this is going to be a little challenging because it's going to seem different. But once you start to grasp what it's getting at, it's going to seem like normal in a way. Like, in other words, it's very different than the Prasangika, Madhyamakas, and it's very different than the Vaibhashikas. So in that sense, it might at first seem like, oh, what are they talking about? I don't get it. But once you grasp what they're getting at, it's going to seem like, oh, that's kind of what, it'll seem very natural and normal, I think, in a way. So anyway, that's a preface. But so I'll read the text first on ultimate truth and then talk about it, and then we'll go into conventional. So here, what the text says is the definition of ultimate truth is a phenomena that is ultimately able to perform a function. Ultimate truth, truly established thing, product, impermanent phenomena, compounded phenomena, substance, and specifically characterized phenomena are equivalent, meaning synonyms, right? But let's go back. So, right, it said, so what's an ultimate truth? A phenomena that is ultimately able to perform a function. Maybe so I'm just going to explain the ultimate truth in more detail, because I think actually what I think is, if you only stick with that definition, it's very hard to give rise to a clear understanding of what Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen means. So I'll sort of elaborate on it now. So one point is ultimate truth objects, it says, are ultimately able to perform a function. And when I say what it means in a way, and I was getting at this with the garbage truck example, they're able to perform this school would say they're able to perform a function from their own side, right? And it's from their own side, they have a capacity to perform a function. And an example would be a seed, right? A seed is able to give rise to a sprout. And one point that the Sautondrikas would say is that the object itself and that ability to perform a function does not, according to this school, arise merely through the power of terms or concepts. Does that make sense? So in other words, from their perspective, they would say, well, whether you call that seed a seed or not, it can give rise to a sprout. And it doesn't matter that you are labeling it a seed or saying it will give rise to a sprout. In other words, from its own side, that seed has the potential to give rise in terms of performing a function, right? It's ultimately able to perform a function means it's able to perform a function from its own side. And they would use that example, right? A seed, and from there, if you think about this, right, at first it seems so different from the Madhyamaka perspective. But actually it's closer to our intuitive sense of things, right? In other words, well, seeds, yeah. Like in other words, you would say that, right? Like, whether like if you know that seed is a barley seed or a wheat seed or a whatever, some other kind of seed, right? In other words, doesn't matter. The barley seed can give rise to a barley sprout, right? And a sunflower seed can give rise to a sunflower sprout. And that doesn't depend upon your mind using terminology. It doesn't depend on you having a correct concept about that. It has that ability to perform a function from its own side. That's one point. So where it says ultimately able to perform a function means able to perform a function from its own side, independent of your terms and concepts or anybody's terms and concepts. And then another text gives a different definition or part of a definition, which is it's a phenomenon that is able to exist from its own side without being imputed by conceptuality and terminology, right? And so again, this example of like, it doesn't matter if you label the sprout a sprout or the seed a seed. It's a phenomenon that exists from its own side and has a potential to give rise to an effect, right? Yeah. Anyway, so and there are countless examples of that, right? Like yeah. Anyway, so we can I'll just keep going. Another point is that and this is now we're going to get into a little deeper into this. So an ultimate truth object is the object of perception of an ultimate mind or an ultimate awareness, right, that perceives that truth. And so and this is an important point, is that these kinds of objects, right? So what is an ultimate truth? It's a phenomenon that's ultimately able to perform a function that doesn't depend upon terms and concepts, and that exists from its own side with that capacity to perform a function, right? So what kind of mind perceives that object? And according to this school, it's a direct perceivers perceive that. And so, and I'll read the definition here. So a direct perceiver, a knower that is free of conceptuality and is non-mistaken, in other words, a direct valid cognizer, is that which perceives these kinds of objects. And what that's getting at is, it could sound very complicated, but it's actually simple, right? What that's getting at is, so an ultimate truth object is a thing that exists from its own side and is able to perform a function. What kind of mind perceives that is direct perception. So in other words, that means, like, if I go out in my yard and I see a seed that somebody planted, or somebody put there on the ground, or that fell from a tree, in that moment where my eye consciousness sees it, that's a direct perception of the seed. Does that make sense? Or has my eye consciousness perceived it? And so the example they give is an eye consciousness perceiving blue, right? So it's a direct valid cognizer, it's an ultimate awareness, and it's non-mistaken. So blue is the ultimate truth object, and that direct perception, my eyes looking and seeing blue, or your eyes looking and seeing blue, are direct, valid cognizers of blueness. And so, the important part here to get, in a way, is that external objects exist, right? They exist from their own side, and they're able to, and ultimate truth objects are able to perform a function, right, from their own side. And they're perceived by direct valid cognition, meaning they're perceived by a non-conceptually, right? Once you have concepts, you're no longer engaging with ultimate truth. So in other words, ultimate truth in this school would be direct perception that's non-conceptual. I'm just sort of pausing there. I'm gonna give another very simplistic example, because again, it could seem I'm trying to keep it to mundane examples for a moment, because this is not something it's not something far from our everyday experience. Is if you drink water, right? Let's say you're thirsty and you have a drink of water, right? So water, from its own, according to this school, water would say, well, first of all, that water is an ultimate, that instance. And I said specifically characterized phenomena. That was one of the terms they used, right? Well, I want to explain that. A specifically characterized phenomena means it doesn't mean water in some general sense, right? That's conceptual. See, this school is saying that would be a conceptualization about water. We're saying, no, if you're actually holding, this is tea, but there's, the liquid in this is a specifically characterized phenomenon. It's not generic liquid, it's tea, right? And if I take a sip, right, like that liquid can perform a function from its own side. It's able to quench thirst, right? And it's an object of, actually, like, now it's an object of visual. I'm looking at it, right? So it's an object of visual consciousness. Then I take a sip, and it's an object of direct perception of taste, right? My tongue consciousness is tasting the tea. And so, according to this school, that would be a direct perception that's valid, right? In other words, I'm not perceiving it as something other than what it is. It's a valid cognition, because like I said, John's question, right? Valid cognition doesn't need to be a Buddha or some bodhisattva. It's like, no, my tongue consciousness tastes the tea. The tea has a function from its own side of being able to quench thirst. And so that would be an example of an ultimate truth, in the sense that, and ultimate, right? It's ultimate in the sense that it's correct. It's not invalid, right? It exists as, and according to this school, they would say it exists as it's being perceived. In other words, it is a liquid, it's able to perform a function, and it's correctly perceived by taste consciousness in that case, right? And it has that ability to perform a function from its own side. In other words, my mind isn't making up its ability to quench thirst. If you had a cup of this tea, or anybody had a cup of tea, it would quench thirst. Like it has that functionality from its own side, just like the seed has the ability to give rise to a sprout from its own side. And it's the object of direct perception. It's not something conceptual. It's not an object of conceptual thought, which we're going to get into when we cover conventional truth in a few minutes. But so according to this school, that's the definition of ultimate truth, right? It's that which is perceived by a direct valid cognizer, meaning a non-conceptual consciousness, and it's a thing that's from its own side able to perform a function, or ultimately able to perform a function. Sujata has raised her hand. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Lauren. I think I'm getting confused about, it says specifically that the things that are equivalent include compounded phenomenon. And so I can't get past the idea of the tea that I'm tasting being, I think I'm confused about what it means to be from its own side and compounded. So if something is, the tea is like tea leaves and hot water and all these things happen, right? So I can't see the tea as how are they holding from its own side and compounded simultaneously? I think that is my confusion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, which is a very Madhyamaka question to ask in a way, isn't it? Like, good cut. Now, and that's, I mean, and again, you're asking that question shows, familiarity with Madhyamaka, right? That would be part of a Madhyamaka critique of, it was saying it arose to,
what is I think it's like what is the most indivisible unit that is, so it almost makes the previous school make more sense in a sense. At least they come down to like the smallest, like this is the indivisible thing, or this is the indivisible amount of time, right? But with this, how do you decide when to stop dividing? I think is my confusion about compounded and from its own side.
Actually, this is where, okay, this is great. Now I'm going to jump and quote. I said earlier I was going to hold off on this, but now I'm actually going to quote a line from, from a modern person who's a teacher actually in the Vipassana tradition. So this is a person who follows, is a teacher, I think, who was trained by Jack Kornfield. So it's like that, somebody in that tradition. Who said, I'm going to actually read the quote from her. She says, actually, I'm going to read the whole paragraph in a way, or most of it. She says, there are many things I found powerful about mindfulness meditation, chiefly that it assumes that we are noticing our experiences with an understanding that everything we are aware of has a nature, which Buddhism describes as having three characteristics of existence. The first is the nature of impermanence. Change is constant and all phenomena arise and pass away. The second is the nature of selflessness. There is no enduring or reliable self. We are a series of ever-changing elemental processes, all arising and passing away. And the third is the nature of unreliability, ungovernability, and dukkha, or dissatisfaction. And so the middle of those three, though, right? This person saying, the nature of selflessness, there is no enduring or reliable self. We are a series of ever-changing elemental processes, all arising and passing away. And so in a way, I think that's where, that quote from that person, which this person was obviously found extremely helpful, that this view that she had learned from that tradition, her tradition of Buddhism, right? So in other words, there's no self, actually she says, right, there's no self, right? There's no enduring or reliable self. We are a series of ever-changing elemental processes, all arising and passing away. Right, so this school asserts like that. In other words, things are impermanent, right? And we're without a self, but so the tea, right? They would say the tea is impermanent, but in that moment, because it's an object of direct perception, it exists. Because that which is, remember their definition of an existent is that which is an object of valid cognition, right? So from their perspective, in that moment, tea exists from its own side because it can perform a function in that moment, and it's what's the word? It can perform a function from its own side, and it's an object of valid cognition. And if you were to say, well, it arose due to previous, right? You might say, your argument would be, well, wait a second. Yesterday there was water, milk, and tea leaves. And they would say, yes, those existed yesterday and were able to perform a function. And they were truly existent from their own side, and they had their own entity of being able to perform a function. Now they performed that function, they gave rise to an effect, which was tea, right? And now tea exists in this moment from its own side and has the ability to perform a function. So it exists. It's not permanent, right, according to this school, but it has its own entity and can perform a function, which is quenching thirst, right? Then if later, what's the word? You go pee, then they would say that, and then you see the yellow pee in the whatever toilet or something, right? Then that's a valid cognition in that moment of urine, which, has its own entity and can perform a function from its own side, right? It can go into the water table and whatever, create whatever, do whatever effect it's going to do. And so this school is really emphasizing, and this is where, like, I think it's very similar if you think of what, like, what is it? It's really emphasizing in this moment, right? Like, and if you think of people, this is where I pause, and I think of people I know who practice in the Vipassana tradition, they have this emphasis of in this moment, there's this, and there's that, and like, just be, and actually, I know some, I mean, actually, I had that dialogue with Guogu. He would not say, he's different, actually, but I know some practitioners of Vipassana and also Zen who would say, in this moment, there's just tea. In this moment, there's just sunlight. In this moment, there's just the cat, whatever, something of that sort, right? And it's like, and it's what she's getting at, right? Let go of your concepts. Let go of, your sense of, let go of your concept of a self. Let go of your other concepts. But in this moment, there's just this direct experience of, and actually there are some people who say that, right? There's just, in this moment, there's just tea, something like that, right? No concept, just whatever it would be, and so it's interesting, the school is getting at like direct experience in a way, and letting go of our concepts of self and our concepts about, and also that, and that our concepts of self in particular are the obstacle, but in general, our concepts are that we are not ultimate truth, actually, right? Ultimate truth is, the experience of ultimate truth is this direct perception without concepts. And so what they would actually say, it's interesting, like what your argument would be valid, argument from a Prasangika Majjhimaka perspective would be the beginning of one, right? This school actually would say, they might say in this moment, there's no water, there's no tea leaves, those are your concepts that you're projecting onto. In this moment, the direct perception is there's tea. Why are you adding so many conceptualizations onto your experience? And you can actually feel the validity or the power of their argument in a way, right? They would say, well, you're just making stuff up. You're adding concepts of the past, you're adding concepts of the future, you're adding concepts of your own intellectualization or something. But the ultimate truth of this moment is there's your taste consciousness experiencing tea, in that instant. And it's impermanent, but that's a valid cognition, and it's what's real. They would say that's what ultimate truth, right? This is ultimate truth, meaning that's what's real, is your tongue consciousness in that instant is tasting tea. Everything, and then if you add up, well, it was the tea leaf and it was this. Okay, that's conventional truth, or not, they wouldn't, but they would say that's conceptualization, it's not ultimate truth, it's not your direct experience. Do you get the difference of the feeling of the two? Oh, you're muted.
I'm this is so helpful, thank you. And I'm realizing, so from sort of from the Vipassana perspective, when you are really able to break things down to this very in the practice of it, right, with this micro feelings of like, with this kalapas arising and dissipating, and it's this very subtle flow of sensation. I could see how the trap there is this it's like micro reification of this very pleasant sensation. Like everything's great. Like even suffering becomes sort of, and it's a wonderful technique, right? Like if you have like stomach pain and you can really break it down to just, oh, it's just this arising and that arising, you don't really suffer as much, right? Like wonderful. And at the same time, to my mind, there's a danger there of this, like, it's like micro reification, like life becomes the smallest possible experience of reification of the present moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and from a Prasangika Majjhimaka view, they would definitely say it is a reification, right? Like, in other words, because like, again, we go back to the Heart Suture, right, where it says, what does it say? The 5 areas also are empty of inherent existence, right? And that's what I was thinking, like this woman's quote, right, where she says, we are a process, we are these processes, right? Where there's no permanent, shouldn't say this, but there's no permanent, independent, unitary self, but we are these impermanent processes. The Heart Suture would say, wait a second, the processes themselves are empty, and emptiness is the processes, right? But this school wouldn't say that. This school would say, no, where the, there's like, what's the exemplification of the person? The five aggregates, right? So this school would, from a Madhyamaka perspective, this school does reify the aggregates, let's say, and external objects and so on. Whereas from this school's perspective, they would say, no, that if you negate those, you're being a nihilist, actually, right? They would say, a Madhyamaka who's saying, it's like if this school would say, if I perceive blue, right, that is a valid cognition. When I look at the sky and I see a patch of blue, that's a valid cognition, as you're describing, right? It could be very pleasant, and it's sort of, but they would say that's ultimate truth. It's a direct perception. It's non-conceptual. And if you were to say that blueness is empty, they would say, now you're being a nihilist. There's now you're saying nothing exists. Perception in the moment exists. You could see the force of the argument of this school, actually, and the difference.
Yeah. Lauren, I think you said this earlier, but I think that these schools don't accept that the Heart Sutra was an actual sutra.
Right.
Okay.
For the most part, these went, yeah. Yeah, I mean, most of the followers of this wouldn't accept it as sutra, or if they did, they would say it's a not valid, they would say it's like an interpretable. If somebody in this, mostly they would say it's not, they don't accept the Mahayana sutras, but if they did, they would say, oh yeah, but they would say that's an interpretable. If they did accept it, they would have to say it's one that sort of the Buddha taught for a certain kind of person, but it's not valid. Whereas, of course, Prasangika would say that's the ultimately valid one, and these sutras are interpretable. So every school says that, though, actually, right? The mind-only school says whatever, every school does that with the other, that's how they debate. But yeah. And then Cynthia had a comment.
Yeah, I just have maybe just a clarification. So does the Madhyamaka then believe, because the term in the moment is a relative term. So they are qualifying that in that moment, a function exists. So that alone, because I know Madhyamaka does believe that objects exist with a function, right? Regardless of label, that's more or less the same. So so I understand kind of what was kind of just discussed, but when someone says in this moment that there's this function and that exists, is that contradictory to what Madhyamaka believes, or it's just that it doesn't go further? So I understand that, but if I just stayed in that moment and didn't go further, is that inconsistent or consistent with Madhyamaka?
Question, yeah, that's a good question. I'll clarify, here's the difference in a way, right? They both agree. There is Madhyamakas would also say, actually Prasangika Madhyamakas also would say external objects exist and perform functions conventionally. Here's the difference though. This school would say, so if I have according to this school, right? If I have let's say, like my example earlier, if I go outside and I see a seed that fell off the tree and I directly see it with my eye, right? Consciousness. According to this school, that seed is an ultimate, in that moment, right? I'm having a direct, valid cognition of it. So it's an ultimate truth, right? It's something that can perform a function from its own side. It can give rise to a tree or something like that, right? And so it's an ultimate truth object that's perceived by direct, valid cognition. Whereas from a Prasangika Madhyamaka view, they would say, well, that's a conventional truth object, right? But if you engage in ultimate analysis, if you look on a subatomic level, can you find anything, in the subatomic particles there that's a seed? No, right? And so if you search for an ultimate seed existing from its own side, you won't find it. So they would say the ultimate truth is that that conventionally that seed exists and can perform a function, but ultimately it's empty of being a seed, right? That you can't find a seed when you engage. If you search through every, all the atoms or the subatomic particles of seed, you don't find a seed. And so you have to come to the conclusion that seed exists as merely labeled by the mind. So that's the difference. This school would say, no, the seed itself, you saw it with your eye consciousness, it can perform a function, therefore it's an ultimate truth. So what they're calling an ultimate truth, actually, Madhyamaka would say, that it's a seed and can give rise to a sprout is its conventional nature, but ultimately its ultimate nature is emptiness, because when you engage in ultimate analysis, you won't find it. Whereas this school would say, you don't engage in ultimate analysis of that. You know, it's an ultimate truth, and you leave it as it is, but you recognize that the personal self, as that text said, right? There are different impermanent phenomena, but there's no independent permanent self, and so on. You know, so does that make sense, the difference then? Yeah.
Yes, very much so. Thank you so much.
Yeah, any other questions about their view of ultimate truth? Because if not, maybe what I'll do is I'll describe their view. Yeah, we have time. I'll describe their view of conventional truth, which might even help more to sort of elucidate, you know, because obviously they're connected. And I'll read what first the text says, right? The definition of conventional truth is a phenomenon that is not ultimately able to perform a function. Conventional truth, falsely established, permanent phenomena, and generally characterized phenomena are equivalent. And so for them, you could say conventional truth, and this comes up in many schools, the Tibetan term. So conventional truth can also mean obscurational truth or veiled truth, a truth which hides something deeper, or a truth which obscures the ultimate nature of things. And so a conventional truth, according to this school, first of all, it's an object that is not able to ultimately able to perform a function, or from its own side, it's not able to perform a function. And another definition they gave in one of the commentaries, or part of the definition, is a phenomena that comes into existence by merely being imputed by conceptuality and terminology. So, you know, that's really a core difference, is that, and a conventional awareness is not a direct perceiver. It's a facsimile of a direct perceiver, and a mind that knows by way of a mental image or a conceptuality. So remember, direct perception is non-conceptual, right? Here we're getting at conventional cognition is a conceptual cognition. And this is a big topic, actually, this whole topic of conventional truth according to this school, but we'll start today, because this is really a core of understanding this school, I think, are these two truths, which then we'll explain. Once you understand these, you can understand their view of selflessness, which we've already started to talk about, and so on. But the idea here is, so I mentioned earlier, I want to use this term earlier, like when I talked about the tea I was holding, right? Is it like the tea in this cup is a specifically characterized phenomenon, which means it's specific. It's that tea, it's this tea, right? But when we talk about conventional truths, we start talking about generally characterized phenomena. And that is, like, if I say tea, right? Like each person has a generally characterized idea. What's tea, right? It's a general category. And it's a mental image. That's what we're talking about. It's a concept. It's a mental image of tea, right? And so one thing is, so conventional truths are these kinds of concepts, right? Or related to these kinds of conceptual mental images or concepts. And one thing that's this is the part that's kind of important to get, I think, so I'm going to try to talk about it now, is, and there are a few core ideas here, but I'll start with this one. Okay, so according to this school, what we do almost all like very, very often, let's call it that, is we relate to the world through our concepts, right? Which is undeniably true, by the way, isn't it, that we do that? And we mix our concept of a thing with the thing itself, and we don't differentiate, right? We don't clearly differentiate that, right? So, and that's true, according to this school, right? Like, that's true so much of the time, isn't it? Where you have a label, we have labels, we have terms, we have concepts, and we have mental images, and I'm going to use a simple example, actually. Like, actually, like, just in this moment, look at somebody else on the screen in this Zoom meeting, right? Somebody who you've seen before. Right? Most of you have seen other people before in this meeting, right? And if you do that for a moment, right, like, or as you immediately think, like, oh, that's so and so, right? Oh, there's whatever, and you have a mental image of that person, right? You think, oh, they're nice, or they get on my nerves, or whatever. I don't know, or they're sweet, or they're not sweet, whatever. You have some idea of that person, right? And that's not direct. And then to contrast it with direct perception, right? Like, actually, you can do it in this moment, right? Like, so you have, and it's, see how much it's mixed, right? A direct perception in this case, if it's me, it could be ear consciousness. Otherwise, it's eye consciousness if it's anybody else in the meeting, right? So, like, and can you do it actually? How long can you stay with just the direct perception, right? Without a label, like, right? Without a concept. Who is that? Or, oh, those are glasses. Or, oh, they have whatever, this color hair, or whatever it would be, right? They're wearing a shirt of this color, or whatever it would be, right? And you see the difference? Like, in other words, how quickly we, and how much of the time our perceptions are connected to our concepts, right? And it's connected to what Sujata was saying about these, there's one, it was, if you were actually being, when you're in the mode of conventional truth, right, you actually have to stay totally, I mean, that kind of, that's why I use that phrase, in the moment. Actually, the philosophers here don't use the word in the moment. I added that, right? But it was when you're in the ultimate truth mode, because things are impermanent, right? One of the synonyms for an ultimate truth object is an impermanent object, right? So in other words, when you're in that ultimate truth mode, you're in the moment, in the sense that that's all there is, right? Because things are continually changing, right? Whereas conventional truth is not in touch with that impermanence, right? You say, oh, there's Linda. I've known Linda for years, right? Whatever. And Linda's this nice person, and that has nothing to do with this moment, right? That's my concept about, in this case, I would say Linda, right? Like, and so are you getting the difference? I'm just trying to point out, and we mix it. We don't even notice that we're mixing them, right? And the same thing, right? Like, I use the example, it didn't happen today, but the garbage truck, right? Like, so as soon as it's like a loud sound, and as soon as I hear that sound, I might go, oh, like, so loud or something, right? Immediately, that's conceptual, right? There is ultimate truth would be just an ear consciousness, right? An example would be an ear consciousness registering sound, right? But as soon as I go, oh, like it's not even realizing it, I'm thinking, oh, that's loud, and I don't like loud sound or something, whatever. I have some concept, right? So conventional truth objects, right? First of all, and are our concepts. That's the point, right? Or is something that we know by way of concepts, right? And a conceptual object doesn't directly perceive a specifically characterized phenomena. It's general, right? It's saying whatever. So you've created a generally characterized, which means a mental image, right, of the thing, and you've mixed that mental image with your perception, I guess you could say, of the thing. And the key here, a few key elements. One is, and I'm going to use another term now, right? You have a mental image, you have a concept, or the technical term they sometimes use is meaning generality of that object, right? And again, I'm just trying to get at what that is, right? So, and we're going to get into more philosophy about it in a minute, but like, I'm trying to think of an example, like, well, everybody, okay, like, so for a moment, just in this moment, whether she's alive or not alive, think of your mother. Right? Think of your mom, right? And that's the meaning generality, right? You have a mental image of your mother. Actually, even if you never knew her, you have a mental image of your mother. I've discovered that, like as a psychology, that's one thing I discovered. People who've never met their mother have a mental image of their mother. I just picked an object, a person, something other than yourself, right? So unless your mother is in the room and you're staring at her, you're relating to a mental image of your mother, right? And one is like, well, actually, think about it. I'm just going off on a tangent for a second. What's the relationship between that mental image and the actual person, right? And now I want to say, so, and that it's this kind of generic image, right? It's this image that that your mind has constructed through concepts, labels, whatever. And what they're getting at here is, one point is that mental, it says, I'm going to be a little silly for a second, but it says cannot ultimately perform a function from its own side, right? So in other words, that mental image of your mother, first of all, can't give birth, also can't eat dinner, doesn't go to the bathroom, doesn't sneeze or sleep, right? It's a mental image. That's what they're getting at here, right? And if I have a mental image of seed, right? Seeds, that was one example I gave earlier. It's a more traditional Buddhist example, right? Like there is my mental image of an oak seed will never give rise to an oak tree. It can't function from its own side. See, that's what they're getting at here. It doesn't perform that function from its own side, and it only exists through the power of conceptuality, right? That's what they're getting at. And another point they're getting at, you see in these synonyms, right? So it says here, so when they say conventional truth, that's what they're getting at, right? Then they say falsely established. Falsely established means it mixes the mental image with the object, but you don't know that in the moment, right? You confuse the two, so it's false in that sense, right? I want to say now permanent phenomena. And remember, in Buddhism, permanent doesn't mean never changes, right? Impermanent means changing instant by instant. Permanent means it's not a functioning thing that changes instant by instant, right? And what we're getting at here is that mental image is permanent, and not in the sense of it'll last forever, but in the sense that it's not a functioning thing that changes instant by instant. It's a mental image, right? Which you can modify at some point. But when I said, think of your mother, right? The image that came to mind was whatever image you've developed of your mother over time that you've had most recently is the one that came to mind, right? And if I say oak seed, I have a very kind of general, I don't have a good image of what an oak seed is. So if I say oak seed, I have some general idea, right? That's kind of a static idea. Now, if I go take a class about botany or something, I'll learn more and my mental image then will change, but then I'll have another idea of an oak seed. And it becomes this kind of static idea, if that makes sense. It's not impermanent. So again, you get the idea. Permanent doesn't mean it'll never change. Permanent means it's not something changing instant by instant like an actual external oak seed, right? It's like we create this mental image and it's static until something happens that we modify, and then again it's static, right? So anyway, so that's where I'm going through the synonyms here. So that's permanent. And then generally categorized phenomena, right? That, like I said earlier, the tea in the cup is a specifically characterized phenomenon, right? It's this liquid. But like when I just say the word tea, right? Like I have this kind of, just like I had with my mother or whatever, now I have a mental image, tea, right? And actually try it, right? Like if I say, actually it's kind of funny in a way, like I'm just playing with it. Like I gave the formal definition, but now I'm going to just play with it for a second, just to give people, I'm hoping it gives you like a feeling, I'm going to use tea, for example, like, I don't know if you're a tea drinker, doesn't matter, but like, if I say Japanese tea ceremony, now what's your image of tea? What's your mental image? Now I'm going to say Queen Victoria of England. What's your mental image of tea? Now I'm going to say Starbucks. What's your mental image of tea? You see, and those are different, generally characterized phenomena. None of those are actual tea. They don't perform the function of quenching thirst, right? But if you think of, if I say, you know, again, like if I think Japanese tea ceremony tea, right, then I have this mental image. Green tea, black tea. That's great. Very good. Oh, that's great. That's really good. You get the idea, right? That you get this, each of those is not, and you see the difference here. None of those is a specifically characterized phenomena, right? None of those can perform a function from its own side of quenching thirst or something, whatever it would be, or giving rise to taste, good taste or bad taste. And do you see what I'm getting about permanent? In other words, like that one, like Japanese tea ceremony tea, right? At some point you learn what a Japanese tea ceremony was enough, or something about it, maybe not much. Or maybe you learned a lot, maybe you've been at one, right? But either way, you developed a mental image of that. And whatever, when I said Japanese tea ceremony and then tea, whatever your mental image was, whether it was from having been at one or just having seen a picture of it once or something, that same mental image arose, right? That you gave rise to at some time in the past. And it's this kind of static image. And you see what we're getting at? It's not a functioning thing that functions from its own side in the sense that we were saying earlier, right? It can't quench thirst. You know, and the same thing, right? If I say sesame seed, right? You can give rise to a mental image of a sesame seed. That image, first of all, it won't function from its own side, right? To give rise to a sesame sprout, right? And do you see how though, if like, that we don't differentiate clearly the difference between our mental image and the specifically characterized phenomena, right? This thing itself, you could say, the ultimate truth, which is the actual, you know, if you're holding it, if you put a sesame seed on your tongue, you know, and you feel it with your tongue or something, or you bite it and you taste it, right? That moment would be ultimate truth, according to this. Whereas when I say sesame seed, you give rise to a mental image, and we blend those all the time, is what this, or not all the time, but so much of the time. Sujata is
What would they make of when the first time you said sesame seed, I literally felt, I had a feeling of biting a sesame seed and then my mouth started watering. So it did serve a function, like in a sense, like even though it was a completely imaginary sesame seed, my mouth watered at thinking of the, you know, of biting a sesame seed and the, you know, that paste coming out and like, so I have trouble, I think, sometimes with the concepts not serving a function in a sense, like just because my mind is so like it can do that sort of thing, right? Everybody's can.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll go through a few things. One is, I think your question or your comment made a couple of interesting points. One is that sometimes I think it's a trick with what I'm using this term, I use the term image, which kind of implies visual, I think sometimes, or maybe meaning generality or something is a better term, maybe a better use. One point, so this isn't the core of your question, but one point I'm making is that these concepts don't have to be visual. In other words, it could be sound, you know, so our mental image can be, what's the word? A sound mental, you know, it can be sound, it can be tactile, it can be taste, it can be all, you know, so that's one point. You know, like sugar, you know, you could think of the visual image, but you could also think of sweetness, right? And remember the flavor of sweetness or chocolate, that, you know. So it's not necessarily visual is one point. But I actually find, there was a quote I wrote down, which I want to see if I can find quickly. I won't show you here. Oh. It's just getting at what you're asking about in a deeper way. And so let me see if I find it quickly, I'll find it. If not, I'll just say it. But I'll actually read, this is from Jeffrey Hopkins, Maps of the Profound, which is a huge, I mean, you can see how this is a bigger text. You know, we're studying Jetson Chogi Gelsen's text, which is like that. This is John Young Shepa's, his translation of John Young Shepa's great treatise on the Tenets. But but this gets it. So this gets deeper. So I'll actually read a section that gets it. I think they're at least the traditional, because I don't want to make up my own answer. So here, this actually comes from Dharmakirti. So he's saying this is a sub commentary, but that's quoting. So it says Dharmakirti's commentary on Dignaga's compilation of pramana of valid cognition says that a specific, so here it is, a specifically characterized phenomena, right? So that was that term, the tea in the cup, right? The specifically characterized phenomena exists ultimately, and it gives 4 reasons. So I'm going to go through, and then it's going to get, and then it'll answer your question about generally it's Dharmakirti's at least point about that. So here he says, this is why, according to Dharmakirti, this is why specifically characterized phenomena exist ultimately. Because of being able to perform a function of producing its own effects. Because of appearing distinctly, that is uniquely, to an awareness that takes it as an appearing object. Because it is a phenomena, the entity of which is incapable of appearing fully as an object of awareness merely from an empowering condition that is a verbalizing term, right? So it doesn't only arise due to terminology. And fourth, because it is a phenomena with regard to which an awareness realizing it would not be produced if the object did not exist from its own side, in its own manner of residing, even though other factors exist, such as the sense powers and the mental application, which are other than it. So that's the conventional, I mean, that's the ultimate truth objects, right, which are specifically characterized. Now Dharmakirti goes on, right, and says, generally characterized phenomena exist conventionally because, or generally characterized phenomena exists conventionally because, 1, it is incapable of performing a function of producing its own effects. 2, it appears non-uniquely to an awareness, taking it as an appearing object, right? Non-uniquely. 3, its entity is capable of fully appearing as an object of awareness merely through the empowering condition that is an expression of expressional terminology or term language. And 4th, an awareness that realizes it can be produced merely through the existence of other factors such as the sense powers and mental application. So that's where he's getting at. You see this, the idea. So one is going back to your question about the example of the sesame seed, right? It can appear solely through the power of language, so it's conventional truth, right? The awareness realizing it doesn't depend upon the actual object, right? That's what he's saying here in the 4th one, right? An awareness realizing it can be produced merely through the existence of other factors, such as, you have a tongue consciousness and you have a mental consciousness. And so you give rise by thinking to a kind of physiological experience, but it doesn't depend upon the actual thing, is what they're saying here, right? It can be given rise to just through the power of conceptuality and labeling. Again, I'm going backwards now. It's not unique, right? It's general, right? There is that general sense of, so when you thought about biting into a sesame seed, it was some generic, that's why they say a generic image or a generally characterized phenomenon. It wasn't a specific sesame seed. And it can, and it's interesting, what they would say is, and it can't perform its primary functions, right? That seed could not give rise to a sprout and can't, and the other one is like, right, a sesame seed can, what's the word? If you eat a bunch of sesame seeds, you have calories, right? It'll provide calories to your body that will help you, that'll be another function it could serve, right? And they would say, well, it's not performing its function, the functions of a sesame seed in their view. And that's, you're seeing a critique of this school, but that's what this school was saying, yeah, you get it. So that's why I wanted to ask from this school's perspective. And that's that's actually Dharmakirti. And it says here, I'll just read one last part. It says, because this also hints at what you were earlier. Dharmakirti goes on to say, compounded phenomena must have their own unique characteristics. This is because a phenomena specifically characterized, but it has to be realized because it has to be realized by an awareness that takes it as its appearing object through the appearance of its own unique characteristics. For this reason, it is not an object of terms, because this entity is not capable of fully appearing to a consciousness arising solely through terms. Yeah, and an awareness of it, realizing it is not produced through the mere existence of terminology, mental application, and so on, which are other than it, right? And that's the other thing they're getting at. Why it's a conventional truth is that even though it gives, even though, and then many things are like that, we can sort of, if we think deeply about anything, any object, we can give rise to some kind of physiological reaction. But what they're saying is that's conventional because it's not helping, it's produced merely through conceptuality, and it's not connected to the actual thing. That's what they're saying. And the actual thing is the ultimate truth, right? Whereas you're sort of engaging in and they're not saying conventional truth has no truth. That's part of it, right? They call it conventional truth because it has a truth in the sense that it's not that there's, what's we say? If you think about a sesame seed, it's not that that has no connection to sesame seeds, right? So there is a sense in which it's a truth, so it's conventional truth, but that's why they say, but it's, what's the word? It's obscures, right? It obscures us from actually tasting, so to speak, in this case, the ultimate truth, which is an actual sesame seed. And it obscures us because we confuse it with an actual sesame seed, but it's not an actual sesame seed. So it's just conventional, and it's not in touch with the ultimate truth of direct experience of an ultimate truth object, which is a thing in and of itself, in a sense, in the school's view. Yeah, I sometimes also, though, struggle with the part about producing effects, because, of course, concepts produce various effects in our actual experience in relation to others, in relation to society, in relation to all kinds of things. But you see what this school's getting at. This school's really getting at direct experience of, direct non-conceptual experiences versus conceptual experiences, sort of the key distinction, I think. Anyway, I know we just have 2 minutes. I should pause there to say, so, we covered up to that point, which is, in general, we sort of were able to cover what is conventional truth and what is ultimate truth according to this school. That's really, like, we're going to get into a lot more now, positive and negative phenomena and so on. But I think that's like a core element of understanding this school. Does that make sense? That's really, I want you to cover that today, because I think if you have that, that's like the foundation in a way, right? Is direct perception, which is non-conceptual, gets in touch with ultimate truth, which are objects that can perform a function from their own side. And then conventional truth is a different kind of awareness, right? It's an awareness that's conceptual, that knows things by way of generally characterized mental concepts, and those things don't perform a function from their own side, right? Whereas in the sense that your concept of seed doesn't give rise to a sprout. Your concept of water doesn't quench your thirst, and so on. That's the idea. But okay, well, we should do our dedication then. So the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Lauren.
Lauren.
See you all the next time.
Thank you. Bye.